The thunder cracked overhead as Virginia Steele stood outside the small wooden church in Redemption Creek, Montana Territory. 1878, watching her dreams collapse around her like the raindrops that threatened but hadn't yet fallen. The white lace of her wedding dress felt suddenly too tight, too heavy on her skin as she clutched her bouquet of wildflowers and prairie roses with trembling hands. "He isn't coming, is he?" She whispered to no one in particular, her voice carrying on the wind as the small gathering of townsfolk shifted uncomfortably behind her. The answer was in their pitying eyes, in the way her father wouldn't meet her gaze, in the hushed murmurs that drifted from the church steps. Frederick Billings, the banker's son with promises as empty as the Dakota plains, had left her standing alone on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. The telegram had arrived just minutes before he'd taken the morning train east, back to Boston. Back to the life he'd claimed to have left behind. Virginia's tears welled up, blurring the dusty Main Street before her. The wildflowers slipped from her grasp, scattering across the dirt as a sob escaped her lips. She hadn't noticed the lone figure approaching on horseback, his silhouette cutting through the haze of her grief. Preston Ford pulled the reins of his chestnut mare, dismounting with the fluid grace that came from a lifetime in the saddle. The stranger's arrival barely registered with the distracted wedding guests, all eyes fixed on the abandoned bride. But Preston clearly saw the moment her composure fractured completely, watched as the carefully arranged bouquet tumbled from her fingers. He'd ridden into town not 15 minutes earlier, dusty from the trail and looking for nothing more than a hot meal and perhaps a room at the boarding house. Instead, he found himself kneeling in the dirt before a weeping woman in white, gathering scattered blooms with calloused hands. "These look too pretty to be lying in the dust, madam," he said, his voice low and steady as he rose to his full height. Preston held out the reassembled bouquet, meeting Virginia's tear-filled eyes with unexpected gentleness. Virginia looked up into the face of the stranger's son, browned and weathered, with eyes the color of a summer storm. Not handsome in the polished way of Frederick, but striking in a rugged, honest way that made her breath catch despite her sorrow. "Thank you," she managed, accepting the flowers with unsteady hands, "though I don't have much use for them now." Preston tilted his hat back slightly. "Seems to me flowers always have a purpose, even if it changes from what we first intended." Something in his words reached through Virginia's humiliation and heartbreak, touching a place that resonated with unexpected truth. Before she could respond, her father stepped forward, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Virginia," Edward Steele said softly, "perhaps we should go home." The small crowd had begun to disperse, whispers following in their wake. Virginia felt the weight of their pity like a physical burden crushing what remained of her dignity. "Yes," she agreed, her voice barely audible, "there's nothing left here." Preston Ford watched as the bride was led away by her father, her white dress trailing in the dust of Redemption Creek's Main Street. Something about her lingered in his mind, the quiet dignity in her tear-stained face, the way she'd accepted the returned bouquet with such grace, despite her broken heart. He hadn't planned to stay in town more than a night. But as he led his horse toward the livery stable, Preston found himself wondering what might keep a man in Redemption Creek beyond morning. Virginia sat motionless at her bedroom window, watching as darkness settled over the valley. The wedding dress lay discarded across her bed, a ghostly reminder of her public humiliation. She'd changed into a simple cotton dress, unpinned her elaborately styled hair, and washed away the tears that had streaked her face. 3 soft knocks at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Virginia." Her mother's voice was tentative, concerned. "There's stew if you're hungry." "I'm not, Mother, but thank you." Silence lingered between them, broken only when Elizabeth Steele sighed and said, "That cowboy who picked up your flowers came by, left something for you." Virginia turned from the window. "What?" "Just a small package. I've left it outside your door." Curiosity drew Virginia across the room once her mother's footsteps had receded down the hallway. She opened the door cautiously, finding a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Beneath it lay a folded note. Back in her room, she unfolded the paper. "Miss Steele, these reminded me of the flowers you carried today. They won't wilt as quickly. Sometimes beauty that lasts is worth more than the kind that fades." Preston Ford inside the package. Virginia found a delicate wooden carving a spray of wildflowers so intricately detailed she could almost smell their fragrance. Her fingers traced the petals, marveling at the craftsmanship. "Preston Ford," she whispered to herself, the name unfamiliar yet somehow comforting on her lips. The following morning dawned clear and bright, as though the previous day's storm clouds had never gathered. Virginia rose early, determined to face the town despite the whispers she knew would follow her. Hiding away would only prolong the gossip, transform her into the tragic figure they all expected her to become. She dressed simply and pinned her hair with careful precision, tucking Preston's carved flowers into her pocket like a talisman. The general store was her first destination. They needed coffee, and Virginia refused to send their housekeeper, Martha, to face the curious stares on her behalf. As she pushed open the door, the bell announcing her arrival caused every head to turn. Conversation stuttered to a halt. Virginia lifted her chin and nodded politely to Mrs. Wilkins behind the counter. "Good morning." "Virginia, dear," Mrs. Wilkins said with obvious surprise. "I didn't expect to see you out so soon." "We still need coffee, Mrs. Wilkins," Virginia replied evenly. "Life continues, does it not?" From the corner of the store, a voice drawled. "Some might say it improves when certain plans fall through." Virginia turned to find Preston Ford leaning against a shelf of canned goods, a slight smile touching the corner of his mouth. In the clear light of day, she could better see the man who'd gathered her flowers, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly where it met his collar. Not a young man, but not old either, perhaps 30 to her 22 years. "Mr. Ford," she acknowledged, surprised by her sudden self-consciousness. "Miss Steele." He straightened, approaching with a casual confidence that seemed natural rather than practiced. "Did you receive my small offering?" Virginia touched her pocket where the wooden flowers rested. "I did. It was a thoughtful gesture, Mr. Ford. You're quite talented." "Nights on the trail give a man time to develop peculiar skills," he replied. "May I carry your purchases?" "I'm headed back to the boarding house myself." Mrs. Wilkins watched with undisguised interest as Virginia hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." Outside on the boardwalk, Preston fell into step beside her. "People are staring," Virginia noted quietly. "Let them," he replied, unconcerned. "They'll find something new to gossip about soon enough. And until then, you hold your head high and remember that another man's failing says nothing about your worth." Virginia stopped walking, studying his face. "You're unusually philosophical for a cowboy." Preston's laugh was warm and genuine. "And you're remarkably composed for a woman who had her heart broken yesterday. Perhaps we're both more than what others see at first glance." Something shifted in Virginia's chest, the first stirring of interest beyond her pain, a curiosity about this stranger who spoke with such unexpected wisdom. "What brings you to Redemption Creek, Mr. Ford?" she asked as they resumed walking. "I've been hired to break horses for the Carson Ranch outside town," he explained. "Should keep me busy through autumn at least. So you're staying." "It appears so." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Though I'll admit, the town holds more appeal today than it did yesterday." Virginia felt warmth creep into her cheeks. "Mr. Ford, Preston," he corrected gently. "Preston," she repeated, the name feeling intimate somehow. "I appreciate your kindness, but I'm not in a position to." "That is, I've just experienced a significant disappointment." "I'm not asking for anything, Virginia," he said, her name sounding different in his low voice. "Just offering friendship to someone who might need it right now." They'd reached her family's house, one of the larger homes in town, befitting Edward Steele's position as the town's only doctor. Preston handed her the package of coffee. "Good day, Miss Steele." As he turned to leave, Virginia called after him, "I ride most mornings along the creek past the old mill." Preston tipped his hat, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Good to know." 2 days later, Virginia guided her mare along the familiar path by the creek, the early morning sunlight filtering through the cottonwoods. She told herself she wasn't looking for Preston Ford, that her morning ride was simply routine, not hope. The sound of another horse approaching made her heart quicken embarrassingly. Preston appeared around the bend, his chestnut mare moving at an easy trot. "Good morning," he called, genuine pleasure in his voice as he drew alongside her. "You found me," Virginia observed, trying to sound casual. "You weren't exactly hiding," he pointed out with a grin. "Besides, there aren't many who appreciate the dawn hours like we do." They fell into step, horses walking side by side as the creek gurgled beside them. Virginia found conversation came easily with Preston. He spoke of his years working cattle drives from Texas, of winters spent in Wyoming, of the changing landscapes he'd traversed. "And your family?" she asked eventually. A shadow crossed his face. "Lost my parents young. My uncle raised me on his ranch near Laramie until I was old enough to ride out on my own." "I'm sorry," Virginia said softly. Preston shrugged. "Life shapes us in different ways, some through loss, others through love. And some through public humiliation," Virginia added wryly. Preston reined his horse to a stop, facing her directly. "You know, Frederick Billings did you a favor." Virginia raised an eyebrow. "Did he?" "A man who runs before making vows would have eventually run after making them," Preston said simply. "Better to learn his character now than after building a life together." The truth of his words struck Virginia deeply. For the first time since the disastrous wedding day, she felt something like relief mingled with her pain. "Perhaps you're right," she conceded. "I usually am," Preston replied with a flash of humor. "It's one of my more annoying qualities." Virginia laughed, a genuine sound that surprised her with its ease. Preston's eyes warmed at the sound. Their morning rides became a ritual over the following weeks. Virginia found herself watching the horizon each dawn, anticipating the moment Preston would appear. They spoke of books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they still harbored. In his company, the whispers of the townspeople faded to insignificance. Her mother noticed the change in her spirits. "That cowboy has been good for you," Elizabeth observed one evening as Virginia helped prepare dinner. "You're smiling again." "Preston is just a friend," Virginia insisted, though the words felt incomplete somehow. Elizabeth gave her daughter a knowing look. "Of course." On a particularly warm September afternoon, Virginia found herself at the Carson Ranch, ostensibly delivering medicines from her father's practice. In truth, she'd volunteered for the errand knowing Preston would be there. She found him in the corral, working with a spirited black gelding. Virginia watched from the fence as Preston moved with practiced confidence, his voice a steady stream of reassurance to the nervous animal. There was a poetry to his movements, a relationship built on mutual respect rather than dominance. When the horse finally accepted the saddle without protest, Preston looked up and noticed Virginia. His face lit with a smile that made her heart flutter. "Enjoying the show?" he called, walking toward her with that easy grace she'd come to admire. "I've never seen someone work with horses quite like you do," she admitted. Preston reached the fence, resting his arms on the top rail. "Animals know when you respect them, not so different from people that way." Virginia handed him a canteen she'd brought. "You looked thirsty." Their fingers brushed as he accepted it, and Virginia felt the contact like a current through her body. Preston held her gaze a moment longer than necessary as he drank. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, passing the canteen back. "The Harvest Festival is next weekend. Would you consider attending with me?" Virginia hesitated. The festival would be her first public social event since the wedding disaster. Everyone would be watching, comparing, whispering. People will talk, she said quietly. Preston's expression grew serious. Let me ask you something, Virginia. Do you enjoy my company? Yes, she answered without hesitation. And do you care more about the opinions of gossips than your own happiness? Virginia straightened her shoulders. No, I don't believe I do. Then I'll pick you up at 6, Preston said with satisfaction. The night of the Harvest Festival arrived crisp and clear, stars pricking the darkening sky as lanterns were lit throughout the town square. Virginia stood before her mirror, smoothing the skirt of her blue dress, not her finest, but one that brought out the color of her eyes. The knock at the front door sent a flutter through her stomach. She heard her father's deep voice greeting Preston, the murmur of conversation as she descended the stairs. Preston stood in the entryway, hat in hand, looking remarkably different in his clean black coat and polished boots. His eyes found hers immediately, warming with appreciation. You look beautiful, he said simply. Virginia felt herself blush like a schoolgirl. Thank you. You clean up quite well yourself. The walk to the town square passed too quickly, filled with easy conversation that calmed Virginia's nerves. As they approached the festivities, however, she felt the weight of eyes turning toward them. Preston seemed to sense her tension. Without a word, he offered his arm, a gesture of support that Virginia gratefully accepted. Remember, he murmured, you have nothing to be ashamed of. The evening unfolded better than Virginia had dared hope. There were curious glances, certainly, but Preston's steady presence beside her made them easier to bear. They sampled Mrs. Patterson's famous apple cider, applauded the children's choir, and joined the dancing when the fiddlers struck up a lively tune. Preston proved to be a capable dancer, guiding Virginia through the steps with the same confidence he showed on horseback. When the music slowed, he drew her closer, his hand warm against her waist. Still worried about what people think? He asked softly. Virginia shook her head. Surprisingly, no. Later, as they walked the long way back to her home, stars wheeling overhead and the sounds of the festival fading behind them, Preston stopped beneath a sprawling oak tree. I'm leaving tomorrow, he said abruptly. Virginia felt her heart drop. Leaving. But you said the Carson job is finished, he explained. I've been offered work down in Colorado, good money. I see. Virginia struggled to maintain her composure. When will you return? Preston's expression was unreadable in the moonlight. That depends. On what? On whether there's a reason to come back. His voice had dropped lower, rougher somehow. Virginia searched his face. Is there? Instead of answering, Preston reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her cheek with unexpected tenderness. I've never been a man to put down roots, Virginia. The trail's been my home since I was 17. And now, she whispered, now I find myself thinking about what it might be like to have someone to return to. His palm cradled her face. But I won't ask for promises from a woman who's only just beginning to heal. Virginia covered his hand with her own. What if she wants to offer them anyway? The kiss, when it came, was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. Then Virginia stepped closer and something shifted between them, igniting like prairie grass in summer heat. Preston's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him as though she belonged there. When they finally parted, both breathing unevenly, Preston rested his forehead against hers. I have to go, he said regretfully. The job, I understand, Virginia assured him. How long will you be gone? A month, maybe 2? I'll be here, she promised. The following morning, Virginia rode out at dawn to their usual meeting place by the creek. Preston was already waiting, his saddlebags packed for the journey. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small wooden carving, this time a perfect miniature rose in full bloom. So you don't forget me, he explained, placing it in her palm. Virginia closed her fingers around the carving. As if I could. True to his word, Preston returned to Redemption Creek 7 weeks later, riding in on a bitter November afternoon as the first snowflakes began to fall. Virginia had been helping in her father's office when Martha burst in, breathless with the news. "That cowboy of yours is back," she announced without preamble. "Rode straight to the livery from the looks of him." Virginia maintained her composure until Martha left, then hurriedly untied her apron. "Father, I need to." Edward Steele waved her away with an indulgent smile. "Go on. I can manage here." The streets were nearly empty as Virginia hurried toward the livery stable, the cold air stinging her cheeks. She found Preston brushing down his mare, his back to the door as she entered. "You're late," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Preston turned slowly, a smile spreading across his face as he took in the sight of her. "Had to outride a blizzard in the mountains," he explained. "Otherwise I'd have been here 3 days ago." Virginia crossed the space between them in quick steps, not caring about propriety or patience anymore. Preston caught her in his arms, lifting her off her feet as his mouth found hers in a kiss that expressed everything words couldn't. "I missed you," he murmured against her hair when they finally drew apart. "Show me," Virginia challenged, eyes bright with emotion. Preston laughed. "Your father might have objections to that particular demonstration." "Then maybe you should speak to him," Virginia suggested boldly. Preston's expression grew serious. "Virginia Steele, are you suggesting what I think you are?" "I'm suggesting," she said carefully, "that a woman who's been stood up once might prefer to do the asking the second time." Understanding dawned in Preston's eyes. He dropped to one knee in the hay-strewn floor of the livery stable, taking her hand in his. "Virginia, I rode 1,000 miles thinking about your smile. I carved a dozen wooden flowers wishing they were real ones I could give you. I'm a man who never thought he'd want to stay in one place until I met you." His voice grew husky with emotion. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Virginia's eyes, not tears of humiliation or heartbreak this time, but of joy so complete it overwhelmed her. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." They married on Christmas Eve, 1878, in the same church where Virginia had once stood abandoned. But this time, as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, it was Preston Ford waiting for her, steady, certain, his eyes never leaving hers. When Virginia reached him, she deliberately loosened her grip on her bouquet of winter evergreens and holly berries, letting it fall to the floor between them. A collective gasp rose from the congregation, memories of her previous heartbreak fresh in their minds. Preston smiled, understanding in his eyes as he bent to retrieve the fallen flowers. Rising, he placed them gently back into her hands, his fingers lingering against hers. "I'll always be here to pick up whatever falls," he whispered, audible only to her. "I know," Virginia replied, her heart full to bursting. As the years passed, the story of the dropped bouquet became something of a legend in Redemption Creek, how Virginia Steele had transformed her greatest humiliation into her greatest happiness. How the wandering cowboy had settled into becoming one of the town's most respected ranchers. By 1885, their small ranch had prospered, and Virginia had given birth to their second child, a daughter, to join their 3-year-old son. On their 7th anniversary, Preston presented his wife with a cedar chest filled with wooden flowers, one for each month they'd been together. "I've never regretted a single day," he told her as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Virginia leaned her head against his shoulder, their daughter sleeping in her arms. "Not even when I made you build that ridiculous chicken coop 3 times because I kept changing my mind," Preston laughed, the sound as warm and genuine as it had been the first time she'd heard it. "Not even then? What made you stop that day?" Virginia asked, returning to a question she'd pondered many times over the years. "When you saw me outside the church, why did you pick up my flowers when you could have just ridden on?" Preston considered this, his hand absently stroking her hair. "I saw someone hurting who didn't deserve to hurt," he said finally. "And something told me that if I rode past, I'd never forgive myself." Virginia smiled, thinking of how different her life might have been if Preston Ford had simply continued on his way that stormy afternoon. The thought was impossible to imagine now. "Do you know what Frederick Billings is doing these days?" Preston asked unexpectedly. Virginia raised an eyebrow. "According to my cousin's letter from Boston, he's managed to lose most of his father's money in bad investments and married some shipping magnate's daughter to restore his fortunes." "Poor woman," Preston murmured. "Indeed." Virginia shifted their sleeping daughter to her other arm. "Though I find myself strangely grateful to him. Oh, if he hadn't left me standing there, you wouldn't have had the opportunity to pick up my bouquet." She reached for Preston's hand, threading her fingers through his. "And I wouldn't have found the man I was actually meant to marry." Preston brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Then I suppose we both owe Mr. Billings a debt of gratitude." "I wouldn't go that far," Virginia laughed. As darkness settled over the prairie, they sat together in companionable silence, their children sleeping peacefully, their home warm and secure against the gathering night. Virginia thought of the frightened, heartbroken woman she'd been 7 years earlier, and silently thanked whatever fate or providence had brought Preston Ford riding into Redemption Creek exactly when she needed him most. "I love you," she said simply, the words well-worn and familiar between them. Preston's arm tightened around her shoulders, his reply as steady and true as the man himself. "And I love you, always will." In the years that followed, Virginia never again dropped her bouquet, though she kept the wooden flowers Preston had carved for her on prominent display in their home. They served as a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings arise from moments that seem, at first, like endings. And whenever a new bride in Redemption Creek expressed fears about her wedding day, Virginia would smile and share her story of tears turned to joy, of a fallen bouquet restored by loving hands, and of the cowboy who taught her that true love often arrives in the most unexpected moments, exactly when we need it most.